The warning signs something is breaking in America's housing market. For years, we were told that home prices only go up, that real estate is the safest investment, that the 2008 crash was a once-in-a-generation disaster that could never repeat itself. And for a while, that story seemed true. Prices climbed year after year. Bidding wars became normal. Homes sold within hours of listing, often far above asking price. But beneath the surface, cracks have been forming. And in 2025, those cracks are becoming impossible to ignore. Across the Sun Belt, home values are falling for the first time in over a decade. In Florida, some markets have experienced 11 consecutive months of price declines. In Texas, cities that doubled in value during the pandemic are now watching that growth evaporate. Inventory is piling up in places where homes once sold before the sign hit the yard. Meanwhile, the average first-time home buyer in America is now 40 years old, not 30, not 35. 40, an entire generation has been locked out of ownership. Watching from the sidelines, as prices soared beyond their reach, the insurance market is collapsing in coastal states. Investors are buying homes at the highest rate in 5 years. And mortgage rates remain stubbornly high, freezing both buyers and sellers in place. This is not a healthy market correcting itself. This is a system under extraordinary stress. And what happens next could reshape the economic landscape of this country for decades to come. The cracks are spreading faster than anyone predicted. The question is whether anyone is paying attention. The American dream deferred. There was a time when buying your first home was a milestone you reached in your late 20s or early 30s. You saved up for a few years after college, found a modest starter home in a decent neighborhood, began building equity that would follow you through the rest of your life. Your parents did it. Your grandparents did it. It was simply what Americans did when they came of age. That path has been shattered beyond recognition for an entire generation of young Americans. The typical first-time homebuyer in America today is 40 years old, according to the National Association of Realtors. This is the oldest age ever recorded since they began tracking this data decades ago. Just 5 years ago, that number was 33. The shift has been breathtakingly fast and absolutely brutal for those caught in its wake. And first-time buyers are vanishing from the market entirely, making up just 21% of all home purchases this year. That share has collapsed by half since 2007. When first-time buyers represented a healthy and normal portion of market activity, nearly 3 million Americans bought their first home in 2004 alone. Last year, that number had plummeted to barely over 1 million desperate and determined buyers. The dream of ownership is slipping further away with each passing year, transforming from an expectation into a distant fantasy for millions of working Americans across this country. The numbers don't lie. The mathematics of home ownership in America have become fundamentally broken in ways that simple budgeting cannot solve. This is not about avocado toast or poor financial decisions among younger generations. The numbers themselves tell a story of a market that's completely detached from the economic reality of ordinary working families. The median home price in the United States reached $410,000 in the second quarter of 2025, representing a 42% increase over the past decade alone. Meanwhile, wages have crawled upward at a fraction of that pace, leaving a chasm between what homes cost and what people actually earn. To afford a median-priced home today, a household needs to bring in approximately $118,000 per year. The actual median household income sits at just $83,000, according to Federal Reserve data. That gap of $35,000 represents an impossible bridge for millions of families. The situation becomes even more alarming when you examine total ownership costs beyond the mortgage payment itself. The Atlanta Federal Reserve calculates that owning a median-priced home now consumes nearly 48% of the median household income. Financial experts have long considered 30% the maximum healthy threshold for housing expenses. Americans are being asked to spend half their income just to keep a roof over their heads in a home they supposedly own outright. These numbers are not sustainable, and markets built on unsustainable foundations eventually find a way to collapse under their own weight. Ground Zero. Florida. If you want to understand where the American housing market might be headed, you need to look at what is already happening in Florida right now. The Sunshine State was the hottest real estate market in the country during the pandemic years. With buyers flooding in from New York, California, and everywhere in between. Remote work had untethered millions from their offices, and Florida offered sunshine, no state income tax, and prices that seemed like bargains compared to coastal cities up north. That fever dream has officially ended, and the hangover is proving to be severe. Tampa has become the epicenter of the correction, posting the largest annual home price decline of any major metropolitan area in the entire nation. Prices there have fallen for 11 consecutive months and show no signs of reversing course anytime soon. The median sale price dropped nearly 14% compared to the previous year in some recent months, a staggering decline by any measure. But Tampa is far from alone in its suffering across the state. Cape Coral has seen prices collapse back to levels not witnessed since the spring of 2022, erasing years of gains in a matter of months. Lakeland, Northport, St. Petersburg, and West Palm Beach have all been flagged by analysts as carrying very high risk of continued major price declines throughout the coming year ahead. Florida was the first domino to fall in this unfolding correction. The Texas reckoning. Texas told the same story as Florida during the pandemic years, just with a slightly different accent. Austin became the poster child for the remote work migration, transforming almost overnight from a quirky college town into a booming tech hub that attracted transplants from Silicon Valley and beyond. Home prices doubled in what felt like the blink of an eye, and longtime residents watched their neighborhoods become unrecognizable as bidding wars pushed values into the stratosphere. The boom that seemed endless has finally hit a wall, and Texas is now confronting the consequences. Austin home values have been declining on a year-over-year basis for months now, a sharp reversal from the double-digit gains that defined the pandemic era. The city that once symbolized the unstoppable American housing boom has become a cautionary tale about what happens when prices outpace local incomes by too wide a margin. And the correction extends far beyond Austin, into markets across the Lone Star State. Dallas has posted price declines exceeding 1% annually, joining a growing list of Texas cities experiencing the same painful readjustment. College Station, Victoria, Waco, and Eagle Pass have all seen their pandemic-era gains begin to evaporate as inventory piles up and buyers grow increasingly scarce on the ground. Texas builders permitted enormous numbers of new homes during the boom years, confident that demand would remain insatiable forever. Those homes are now flooding onto a market where buyers have retreated to the sidelines.
The supply arrived exactly when the demand disappeared.
And Texas is now learning a painful lesson about what happens when builders bet everything on a boom that could not last forever. Florida's insurance nightmare, even if you can afford to buy a home in Florida today. There is another crisis waiting to devour your budget the moment you sign the closing documents. Homeowners insurance has become so expensive in the Sunshine State that it now threatens to make ownership financially impossible for middle-class families who manage to survive the price surge. The average cost of homeowners insurance in Florida has exploded past $5,700 annually, more than double the national average and climbing relentlessly higher with each passing year. Some projections suggest that number could reach an almost incomprehensible $15,000 by the end of 2025 in certain markets. And that figure only covers standard homeowners coverage without flood insurance included. Residents in coastal areas and flood zones must purchase separate policies that add thousands more to their annual carrying costs, pushing total insurance expenses toward levels that would have seemed absurd just 5 years ago. The situation has grown so dire that roughly 20% of Florida homeowners have simply abandoned insurance coverage altogether, gambling that disaster will not strike their particular property this particular year. Insurers have fled the state in droves, leaving behind a gutted marketplace where options are scarce and prices are brutal for those who remain. Hurricane seasons keep arriving with increasing ferocity, and climate risk has transformed from an abstract future concern into a present-day financial emergency that is reshaping where Americans can realistically afford to live. The lock-in effect there is a strange paradox paralyzing the American housing market that defies the normal laws of supply and demand. Millions of homeowners who might otherwise sell their properties and move on with their lives have instead become prisoners of their own mortgages, trapped by financial mathematics that punishes them severely for making any move at all. During the pandemic years, mortgage rates plunged to historic lows that seemed almost too good to be true, Nearly half of all homeowners with mortgages backed by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac locked in interest rates at or below 3.5% during that extraordinary window. They signed those documents believing they had simply gotten a good deal on their home financing costs. What they actually received was an anchor that now holds them firmly to their current property, whether they want to stay or not. Mortgage rates today hover above 6.5%, meaning that anyone who sells their home and buys another will see their monthly payment explode by hundreds or even thousands of dollars. On a $300,000 mortgage, the difference between a 3% rate and a 7% rate translates to nearly $600 more every single month flowing out of the household budget. So homeowners stay put even when their families outgrow their homes or their jobs relocate across the country. The market has frozen solid, with sellers refusing to list and inventory remaining painfully scarce in most regions. Millions of Americans find themselves trapped in homes they cannot leave, watching helplessly as their lives change around them while their mortgages hold them firmly in place. Wall Street's land grab, while ordinary American families struggle to compete for homes they can barely afford. A different kind of buyer has been steadily accumulating properties at a pace that should alarm anyone paying attention. Institutional investors and corporate landlords have transformed single-family homes from places where families build lives into assets that generate returns for shareholders who will never set foot inside them. In the first half of 2025, investors purchased a record 30% of all single-family homes sold across the country. That number represents the highest share in at least 5 years and marks a dramatic acceleration of a trend that began after the 2008 financial crisis. When Wall Street discovered the profits waiting in residential real estate, these buyers arrive with advantages that regular families simply cannot match in competitive situations. They pay cash, waive inspections, and close deals in days rather than weeks, while families scramble to secure financing and navigate the mortgage approval process. When a cash offer lands on a seller's desk alongside a financed offer, the outcome is rarely in doubt regardless of who needs the home more desperately. The concentration has grown especially intense in certain metropolitan areas across the South and Midwest. Some neighborhoods now see corporate entities owning more than 20% of all residential properties, fundamentally altering the character of communities that were built around the assumption of owner-occupied households, maintaining their own small piece of something that once felt attainable for ordinary working families. A generation left behind. The consequences of this housing crisis extend far beyond monthly payments and down payment struggles into something more profound and lasting. An entire generation of Americans is being systematically excluded from the primary wealth-building mechanism that powered the middle class for the past 70 years, and the implications will echo through decades to come. Homeownership has always been the foundation upon which American families constructed their financial futures and passed prosperity to their children. The equity built through mortgage payments and appreciation-funded retirements, college educations, and emergency reserves that kept families stable through economic turbulence. Without access to that latter, young Americans are being forced to build their lives on fundamentally shakier ground. The numbers reveal a generation losing hope in alarming and accelerating ways. 67% of millennial renters now report having zero savings set aside for a down payment, up dramatically from 48% just 5 years earlier. They have stopped saving because they have stopped believing that ownership will ever become possible, regardless of how disciplined their financial habits become over time. Researchers have documented troubling behavioral shifts among young people who have abandoned any hope of ever owning a home entirely. They save less, invest more recklessly in speculative assets like cryptocurrency, and report lower motivation at work because the traditional reward of stable housing feels permanently out of reach. The wealth gap between older homeowners and younger renters grows wider with every passing year of this crisis. The Rust Belt paradox: while Florida burns and Texas bleeds, something unexpected is happening in the cities that America left for dead decades ago. Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Hartford, and Albany are experiencing steady price appreciation and tight inventory at the very moment their Sunbelt counterparts are watching values collapse around them. This regional divergence tells a story that complicates any simple narrative about the national housing market. The crisis is not unfolding uniformly across the country, but rather carving deep divisions between regions that followed very different paths during the pandemic years and now face very different futures ahead. The Rust Belt never experienced the frenzied price explosions that defined markets in Arizona, Florida, and Texas during the remote work migration wave. Prices rose modestly in Midwestern cities, staying closer to historical norms and remaining within reach of local incomes, even as coastal refugees bid up properties in warmer climates by 50 or 60%. That restraint is now proving to be a form of protection against the correction sweeping through overheated markets elsewhere in the nation. Cities that never climbed to dizzying heights have no cliffs to fall from, and their housing markets continue functioning with something approaching normalcy while chaos unfolds in the Sun Belt. The paradox raises uncomfortable questions about where Americans should actually be building their lives and whether the mass migration south was always destined to end in painful regret. Empty streets and familiar ghosts across the Sun Belt. A troubling pattern is emerging in communities that barely existed a decade ago. Master plan developments that sprawled across former farmland and desert scrub during the pandemic. Building boom are now facing a future that looks nothing like the glossy brochures promised to early buyers, seeking their piece of affordable paradise. Builders permitted enormous numbers of new homes during the frenzy years, confident that demand would remain bottomless forever as Americans fled expensive coastal cities. They constructed entire neighborhoods of identical houses stretching toward distant horizons, complete with parks and community pools and streets named after trees that would never grow in such climates. The buyers those builders were counting on have largely stopped arriving in sufficient numbers. 18 states now have housing inventory levels exceeding what existed before the pandemic struck. With for sale signs dotting every third lawn and model homes staffed by salespeople with increasingly desperate pitches, the specter of 2008 haunts every conversation about where this leads next. That collapse wiped out trillions in household wealth and left psychological scars on an entire generation of homeowners who watched their equity evaporate overnight. Experts insist the conditions are different now because lending standards tightened and homeowners carry more equity than before. But troubling similarities are becoming harder to ignore as inventory levels in some Florida markets approach heights not witnessed since the dark days of 2007. Affordability has stretched beyond the breaking point documented during the previous peak, with ownership costs consuming a larger share of household income than at any point in recent memory. The question is not whether history will repeat exactly, but whether it might rhyme uncomfortably close to what came before. Warnings from above, the voices warning about what lies ahead, are growing louder and more difficult for policymakers and market observers to dismiss as mere pessimism or attention-seeking alarmism. Respected analysts and economists who study housing markets for a living are sounding alarms that deserve serious consideration from anyone with a stake in American PLES. One prominent housing analyst has warned that prices would need to fall by approximately 50% in certain overheated markets before reaching equilibrium with local incomes again. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has publicly stated that the housing market has already entered a recession, driven by Federal Reserve policy decisions that kept mortgage rates elevated far longer than many borrowers could sustain. The scale of this crisis has finally pierced the bubble of partisan gridlock that typically paralyzes the federal government on complex issues. The Road to Housing Act of 2025 passed unanimously through the Senate Banking Committee with bipartisan support that would have seemed impossible in the current political environment. The legislation includes provisions for zoning reform, streamlined permitting processes, and funding for communities willing to embrace higher density development.
At the state level,
legislatures across the country have passed over 100 housing-related bills aimed at breaking down barriers preventing new construction. California, Texas, Connecticut, and Montana have all moved to override local zoning restrictions that prevented builders from constructing housing their residents desperately need. But critics argue these reforms arrive years too late and tinker around the edges of a crisis, demanding far bolder intervention than politicians seem willing to deliver right now. What comes next, the housing market that emerges from this crisis, will look fundamentally different from the one that existed before the pandemic reshuffled the deck and dealt Americans a hand many cannot afford to play. The changes underway are not temporary disruptions that will fade once mortgage rates decline or inventory levels stabilize in overbuilt markets across the Sun Belt. We are witnessing a permanent reshaping of where and how Americans will live in the coming decades. Entire regions that boomed during the remote work migration are now confronting painful corrections that will leave some communities diminished for years ahead. Meanwhile, forgotten cities in the Midwest and Northeast are experiencing unexpected revivals. As affordability refugees seek shelter from impossible coastal and Sun Belt prices, the generational wealth divide will continue widening unless dramatic intervention redirects the trajectory that has locked millions of young Americans out of ownership entirely. Those who bought homes before prices exploded will pass that wealth to their children, while those who missed the window will struggle to catch up for the rest of their lives. The American dream of homeownership is not dead, but it has been fundamentally transformed into something far less accessible than previous generations ever experienced or imagined possible. What was once a reasonable expectation for working families has become a privilege reserved for those with inherited wealth, exceptional incomes, or extraordinary luck in their timing. The warning signs have been flashing for years now, and the reckoning has finally arrived at our doorstep.